We're going to get going in about 1 minute. 1 minute. Or maybe sooner than 1 minute. Everyone gets quiet. So, Keith, are we all set? So everyone turn around and wave at the camera. Wave at everyone joining us online. Good to see you all this morning. Whether you're there or here, it is good to have all of us together here on this first Sunday of Lent. First Sunday of Lent always brings out the crowds. There's something about that great litany and all the incense that we just can't resist. So it is good for us to be here. Just a couple brief announcements before we get started. And the first is just a couple reminders, and you're going to hear more about these things in the service. Today we start our Getting Connected class, and it's a phenomenal opportunity to get better connected at All Saints Church. Absolutely, it's for people who are newly arrived in this community, and it's for anyone who just wants to get better connected. It's going to be for the next, I think, 5 or 6 weeks on Sundays at noon. It will start today at noon up in the Learning Center. Even if you haven't signed up, just show up. You'll get fed a nice little lunch. But I really encourage everyone to take this, and it's a great opportunity to get to know people and get to know more about All Saints Church. Also, when you get into church, please take the Lenten cards home with you and invite someone. I always say take 3 of them. One to put on your own refrigerator if things stick to your refrigerator. Things don't stick to my refrigerator. The second is post it at Vroman's or a coffee shop or anywhere with a community bulletin board. And the third is to pick one thing that you're going to go to during Lent or Holy Week and invite someone who maybe they haven't been to All Saints Church ever, or maybe they haven't been in a long time, to come with you. We really want to continue to grow this community, and by far, and it isn't even close, I mean, you should advertise, you should do all these different things. By far, the most effective way of joining a community is when people invite you. And so think about who you can invite. Think about who needs what we have here at All Saints Church. Think about who has what we need here at All Saints Church. And so just invite you to do that, and please invite people. And then there's another Lenten offering that's happening on Thursdays, and it's from 5:45 p.m. to 7:15 p.m. It'll be up in the Learning Center. Some of you may remember Mackenzie Edwards, who was here doing a forum on healing practices several months ago. Well, she's going to lead something called Rest to Receive. And it's a 5-week series centering mindfulness practices and embodied healing. It involves some yin restorative yoga, some yoga nidra. I am the least physically flexible person in the world, and I can do this stuff. So, it's wonderful. There's some journaling. There'll be information at the sign-up center outside, so I encourage you to come on Thursdays and check it out. And we are here this morning to have just a fantastic conversation with a dear friend. Many of you know Gary Hall from his time here as an associate priest here under George Regas. He was also dean of Washington National Cathedral, and now he is, I don't know what to describe you. You're heading up the cathedral, our cathedral's capital plan. Are you still doing that?
The capital campaign is on hold.
Is on hold.
Is this on?
No, it's not. You got to. Here, I got it for you.
Right. Oh, that's true.
You got to push it up.
Turn it on. That's always a good plan. The capital campaign is on hold because we need to hire a development department, so it's on hold.
Okay.
I am the president of Bloy House, the diocesan seminary, until June 30th. It was a 1-year interim gig, and I've been doing it for 4 years now. And Rick Felton over there is our director of development, and so he is still subject to working closely with me. I also worked for Ed. I worked for George the first 5 years I was here, and then Ed the last 6.
Oh, okay.
So I've got war stories from many administrations.
Well, then pull up a chair. There we go. So, but we had Eddie Anderson in here last week, and Eddie's running for LA City Council, and we had more on a local level. We sort of had a talk about the intersection between faith and politics. And you served as Dean of Washington National Cathedral from 2012 to 2015. And that's a whole other different level of the intersection of church and politics. And so I want to start out with, when I first came to All Saints Church to interview here, one of the things that struck me that I loved about it is our location right across from City Hall.
Right.
Because I've really believed that part of the role of the church is to stand before the throne. Well, you were that on steroids at National Cathedral. And just in general, can you just talk a little about your experience as dean there and how you approach that idea of the church being before the throne on a national and even a global scale?
Sure. Before that, I just want to thank you, Mike, for inviting me to do the forum. I never actually got to do the forum in the years I was here. I was always upstairs. And as my father would say, I was never in the main room, always in the lounge. One time I remember I used to pick up my mother who lived in Burbank and come over here. And I picked her up and dropped her off. I said, well, I'll see you upstairs. She said, no, I'm going down to hear Robert Shear in the forum. So even in my own household, didn't get a lot of respect. So I'm really pleased to be here, and it's great to see so many faces. A few things about the National Cathedral. So I went there in 2012, actually left in 2016, and right when I got there, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church had approved same-sex marriage, and which I'd been working for with the Chicago Consultation, which was a group that Bonnie Perry and I worked on, and D.C. had long had same-sex marriage as a policy, as a legal thing. Maryland just passed it in that year, and so when I got there in November of 2012, somebody said, what are you going to do about same-sex marriage? And my predecessor, who was a great man, but was not an issues leader, had not wanted to make a decision about it. And so the first thing I did when I came there is I said, well, it's legal in the whole diocese. We're the cathedral that we're just going to do same-sex weddings. And I had no process. I didn't bring it through the chapter. I didn't do anything. I was surprised that it would be, I didn't think it would be a big story. Because West Point Chapel had already done same-sex weddings. And I said, well, this won't be a big story. And the day we announced it, it was the next day it was in the New York Times, And so, so we started doing same-sex weddings. Through that, I got involved with a guy named David Saperstein. Do you know David Saperstein, who is head of the Reform Judaism's Religious Action Center? And his assistant, Melissa Rogers, went to follow Josh Dubois in the White House Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. And they began, so the Obama administration saw me as an ally. And then the Newtown shooting happened in December of 2012, and I preached on that the Sunday after. Again, that got Marianne Buddy, the bishop, and me on the front page of the New York Times, and we started a big thing about gun violence. So I really got involved in sort of issues advocacy pretty quickly. Then over the course of my time there, the other things I got involved with were the voting rights, the Supreme Court decision on the Voting Rights Act. That became a big issue. And then the last thing I got involved with, I had taught a class at Wesley Seminary while I was there, and one of the students in it was a man named Clementa Pinckney, who was the minister at AME Church in South Carolina, who was shot, was one of the 9 people shot.
Yeah, Mother Emanuel.
And Mother Emanuel. And so right after, the last thing I did was essentially take on I was being interviewed by Scott Simon I was on Scott Simon's show once a month on NPR, and when I was there, and I didn't know we had 2 Confederate windows in the cathedral, and he said, what are you going to do about the Confederate windows? And I said, well, if they've got the Confederate battle flag in them, they got to come out, and that was like the last thing I took on. That was quite controversial at the time, but now has been seen as the right thing to have done, and they did it. So so I got involved in issues pretty quickly there. Now I have to say, the National Cathedral was founded in the early 20th century to be, quote, the Westminster Abbey of the United States, which is typical Episcopalian arrogance,
yes,
right?
Yes,
you know,
right,
it's like, here, we will give you this. And there is a sense in our church that we're the establishment church, and we come from an establishment tradition, established church tradition, and we kind of live into that. And so over time, the cathedral became the place where the presidents are buried, where big national observations happen. I would say that to lead a place like that is to live in a creative tension. On the one hand, the impulse, I'm talking about sitting in the shadow of the throne there, the impulse is to be an uncritical kind of what in theologians call Erastian celebrant of American public religion, right? Yeah. I remember, you can imagine, I got into several hot water moments when I was there. One of them was when we trotted out the big Veterans Day initiative that we were going to have for veterans. I said, okay, when are we going to do a big initiative for Vietnam War resistors? Because if we're the National Cathedral, we should embrace all of the tensions in the culture. We shouldn't just be celebrating, and of course we should celebrate the veterans. Right. I would totally invite, but we all should celebrate the people that resisted the draft at some great cost to themselves and help bring about an end to an unjust war. And the cathedral could never go there. It could never go to that side of the issue. So in some sense, to be in the shadow of the throne is to be doing all the public observances, and then we're kind of, in a sense, in the position All Saints is in, with that you know, to be a spokesperson for gospel values in a culture that is extremely power-oriented and extremely imperial is a difficult thing. My great longtime predecessor, Frank Sayre, who was Woodrow Wilson's grandson and born in the White House, and he was dean there for like 40 years. He's the guy that went to Selma, who brought King, who had, on the night before Nixon's inaugural, had the Leonard Bernstein conducting the anti-war concert. The cathedral was very much in that mode during Sayre's deanship. And then it got out of that mode, largely, I think, because it was worried about money and alienating people. And I was like the experiment, like, should we bring back someone like Frank Sayre? And I think I was way out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
So you know, I told the story before when George Regas preached at my installation. He said, "Do you want me to do anything?" And I said, "Well, yeah, you know, we're sponsored by Lockheed and, you know, all these awful things, and I wish you'd say something about peace." And so he got up in his sermon, said, "You ought to do, Gary, you need to stand against militarism in all its forms." And like 24 people walked out, you know, and so there's a real tension in a place like that. And I'm sorry to say, and I'm very fond of my successor, but they really seem to have backed away from that part of their witness. The Bishop of Washington, Marianne Buddy, is still very much in the public eye. She was the woman that really stood up to Trump when he went with the Bible to St. John's Church, Lafayette Square. I mean, so the bishop has continued that kind of social witness, but the cathedral has really gone back to its comfort zone, which is to be celebrating the public religion part of it without the prophetic part of it.
Well, and it's really, really challenging, and on some levels, I'm not sure it's possible to be the prophetic institution that you really saw, and I agree that the Washington National Cathedral can be, and raise lots and lots of money from people who have gotten their money from the way things are.
Right.
And so I wonder how much even things like the earthquake kind of sealed your fate, of like, oh my gosh, now we have to raise all this other money, and how are we going to do this? And so can you talk about living in that tension of, it's like literally George, I wonder like how much money those people who walked out of that church were prepared to donate to the church. Can you talk about living in that tension of speaking the tough truth in a community that you're really also hoping will give a lot to support the institution?
That's right. I mean, and it's hard. Again, many of our biggest donors were from the arms manufacturing world.
Yeah.
But I would say the issues I took on, I mean, the most blowback I got, well, my biggest personal claim to fame is that when I did the first same-sex marriage there, Franklin Graham called me an apostate. So I was like, yes, I finally made it,
That should be like the first line of your obituary. That's
right.
Great.
The most blowback actually was over guns.
Yep.
And gun control, and which really surprised me. Part of it is because those folks are so organized, and the NRA has since fallen on hard times, and they're in some disarray. But at the time, they were at the kind of the height of their game, and they saw Newtown as the possible fulcrum of when they would lose their hold on American politics. So yeah, it was hard. The cathedral, when I went there, Sam Lloyd, my predecessor, had to cut the budget from $27 million a year to $17 million a year. Which was very painful, and then I had to cut the budget from 17 to 14, and that's a lot of jack, as we say in the church trade. I'm going to send smelling salts out to Rick Felton right now, and the cathedral is kind of it's kind of like a museum. In other words, we had a congregation much smaller than the All Saints congregation on Sundays. You had 1,000 people in church on Sunday, 800 of whom were visitors. And so our donor base was actually people who felt philanthropically drawn towards the cathedral. And I had hoped that my advocacy would bring progressive people with resources to support that. It didn't really happen.
Yeah.
And so the chapter got increasingly nervous the more vocal I became, because they just thought
kind of like the vestry.
they were like our
Yeah.
vestry. They
Yeah.
were like our board. They were just nervous that every time I opened my mouth, it was going to cost them money.
Yeah.
Which it did, actually.
Yeah.
And that. But on the other, my point is always, well, what's the point of this place if
Right.
we're not standing for something? I mean, the United States doesn't need other monuments to itself.
Right.
I mean, there are plenty. We got plenty. I always felt too that the other thing that was the most countercultural that I did, I still remember. I don't think you celebrate it at All Saints anymore, but the Feast of Christ the King.
Yeah, it's now the
last,
celebration of of God's reign or something.
It's the
Yeah.
last Sunday
Yeah.
after Pentecost, and it's we declare Jesus
Reign of divine
as
love. King
King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And I've read enough in my time here, read at the Jesus Seminar people, to say, well, what's this king? This king stuff is crazy. I mean, the king metaphor for Jesus is just crazy. We don't have kings anymore. I mean, Charles is a king. I mean, that we don't. A king is like a figure of fun now, almost more than a figure of actual authority. And so, on my first Sunday there, the first Sunday I had to preach on Jesus as King of Kings, I sort of talked about him as like ironically challenging the notion of kingship. And behind me in the cathedral, there's a big majestus, which is Jesus, holding the world in his hand with a big cross on top of it, And I kept on talking about how ironic all this language was. People were horrified, because the culture of DC is a culture of power. And so to say, well, Jesus is critiquing Rome and critiquing empire, and that we ought not to be celebrating empire but critiquing it. That was actually kind of the most countercultural thing I did when I was dean there, because it was like it went against the fundamental assumptions of the alliance between religion and power.
Yeah. So you had George come and preach your installation, and a lot of what your experience there, I'm seeing the legacy of George Regas sort of working through you, embodied in your ministry. I imagine that as you were preparing to take the job, and probably throughout your term there, you had conversations with George. And I'm just sort of, what's some of the counsel that George gave you in that position? Because Pasadena and Washington, D.C., different places.
Well, they're similar.
They're similar? Okay.
Well, they're similar. I mean, the parts of Pasadena are very much like Northwest Washington. I mean,
say more about that.
Privileged, affluent.
Yep.
I mean, there's an affluent zone around Pasadena, San Marino, various parts of, just as D.C., the northwest part of D.C. is extremely affluent. And actually, to me, one of the challenges when I was there is that to try to figure out how we related to the other districts in the other sections of the district, because the Northeast, say, we had no presence in the Northeast, but we were very present in the Northwest. So I had George come and preach when I was there, and I had Ed come and preach when I was there. And I also had my friend Harvey Guthrie, whom some of you knew because Harvey was Dean of EDS when I was a student there, my lifelong mentor and friend, and came here to All Saints for years for various things. I had them come. George, I got to know George better after he retired than I did working for him. I mean, working for George, it was like, everything was flat out all the time, and you never look back or reflected on anything. But George was very reflective in his later days. And he didn't give me so much advice as neither did Ed give me any advice. I don't think I asked them for any advice, but I found that what I found in George that helped me was the idea of focus. In other words, George only took on one or two issues at a time. And, if I made a mistake, it's like right out of the box, I took on 4 things. And that probably was not wise. George, although George built on, George in many ways transformed All Saints, but on the other hand, All Saints under Dr. Scott and then under Bishop Burt had been very involved in civil rights things and in Dr. Scott very much against the internment of the Japanese. And George, when he first took on the Vietnam War, he did that really as kind of the only thing, and also Union Station, but that was the only thing that they were doing. And then George would then he moved from that to the ordination of women, to the arms race, but he would then to same-sex blessings. But George was very much focused, and I wish I'd learned the lesson of that a little bit better, because I felt like I've got this great thing. Let's see what I can do with it. And I kind of got out of the box and just took on everything too fast. Yeah. Ed, in funny ways, I learned a lot about leadership from Ed. Mm-hmm. Ed, George's way of leading was was unique. George was the only person I've ever known who could see the big picture and the details at the same time. I mean, and I've never known anybody since who was like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, he would worry about how many sugar packets there are in the coffee, by the coffee pot. I mean, I'm not kidding. Yeah. I mean, George knew every level of everything that was going on here all the time. And it was sort of sheer force of working 90 hours a week, having been in the restaurant business, which was not unimportant in the way he ran the church. But Ed was much more focused on issues of governance and shared leadership and authority, and I actually learned a lot about governance and how to work with the board, because I actually did get along well with the chapter, but I had to work hard to bring them along with me. Right. But I learned a lot about that stuff from Ed. So, I mean, my All Saints experience was very, very helpful to me.
That's good. you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about sort of the cathedral and really the irony piece. But it really is kind of this symbol of Christian nationalism and triumphalism, the idea that we have a national cathedral and a national place of worship, and it's a Christian church.
Right.
And like, what do you see? And I'm not asking, like, I don't want you to talk about your successor. We're not going to get into that. But just to sort of, in general, the role of the church right now, we're an Episcopal church. That cathedral is one of our churches. We're a part of this legacy.
Right.
And we're in a state right now where we have a rise in Christian triumphalism and a rise in Christian nationalism. And where do you see us as a church? Where are we, and where do we need to be?
Well, I actually think my successor would agree with me on this, but because he's a really good guy. What I would say is that what brings me back, what roots me as an Episcopalian is remembering that we were the established church in England. When we came to the United States, the Church of England after the Revolution was not a good brand. So we had to change our name to the Episcopal Church. But, our great theologian, Richard Hooker, who wrote the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity in the 1590s, around the same time that Shakespeare was writing his great tragedies, one of Hooker's great ideas was what he called commonwealth, but we would translate as common good. And I would say that what makes, for us, if we have any claim, it's in our commitment to the common good. It's not in our triumphal assertion of ourselves as the unofficial official church of the United States. And I think we share with with Jews and Muslims and Buddhists, we share this idea of the common good as the way in which we appropriately serve the nation. So that advocating for economic justice, advocating for racial justice, advocating for same-sex, transgender, queer rights, advocating for all of those things, is advocating for the common, is standing with others for the common good. And we were at one point, we've always described ourselves as a comprehensive church, having both high church, low church, Catholic, Protestant, liberal, conservative members. The liberal conservative thing is strained right now. It's been strained really since 2009, when we first passed same-sex blessings, and then in 2003, I guess, when we approved Gene Robinson's consecration as Bishop of New Hampshire, and then the succeeding general conventions, and then 2012, 2015, 2012, the approval of same-sex marriage. Susan knows the chronology much better than I do, but we had a wholesale exodus of conservative people from the church. And, we've lost some of those people, I think, unfortunately, because they just don't want to deal with the things we're standing for these days. We've lost some of those people, I think, because we've not reached out to them. Some of the more moderate conservatives we've not reached out to. So I think there's ways for us to rebuild a more comprehensive community, but we now stand where we stand. And, I was really fortunate to be the dean of the cathedral during an administration that understood our values as the values of the nation.
Right.
Thank God I left before the election in 2016.
Right.
I mean,
yeah. Or not.
You would be visiting me at Gitmo right now.
We'd zoom you in from Gitmo. But that raises another question, and really you sort of talked about the split in the Episcopal Church, and now we're looking at just the divisions in this country are so deep. And I'm a big believer of you work hard for the best and you prepare for the worst.
Right.
And we're looking, starting in 2025 at either a second Biden administration or a second Trump administration. And so, first of all, what is the best and the worst case scenarios, and how do we work and how do we prepare as a church?
Oh, wow.
Easy question.
Yeah, aren't we out of time? Let me say a couple things. First of all, I am still kind of persona non grata at the cathedral, not because of anything I did when I was there, but because in January of 2017, I contacted the bishop and dean and said, please don't host Trump's inaugural prayer service at the cathedral. He is against everything, every possible value of Christian faith and practice. And I got very nice dismissive responses for them saying, you know, we really want to reach out and, you know, blah, 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 big tent, we want to be. And Mary Ann, and I'm very fond of Bishop Buddy, she's a great person. She was at the time very hopeful that we could, you know, reach out and that Trump would change and he would be a different person.
It's a characteristic of abusive relationships.
A lot of people felt that way at the time, that when she gets inaugurated, the job will change him, right? So I was so teed off, as we would say more politely. I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post and basically said the same thing, that the cathedral really shouldn't be doing this. And that was seen as just a horrible act of disloyalty to the cathedral by everybody. And I haven't been invited back since. So having said everything I've said about reaching out and a broad church, I think we become guerrilla fighters if Trump is reelected. Honestly, I mean, you know, I'm going to the hills. I mean, I don't. It's either that or just be a quietist and sit around and do nothing. And watching what happened to Navalny on Friday, and the fact that, you know, 45 has said nothing about that. That we're really facing, I think, a very different kind of second administration. Now, I'm pretty well. You'll hear in my sermon. I'm more hopeful than that. I think, given everything that's happening now, I just think it's just beginning to pile up. Yeah. But I'm still I mean, 77 million people voted for Donald Trump in the last election. Yep. And, you know, my dad was working class guy from New York City. All of my father's relatives in Long Island are Trump people. I go back there every year and we have these fights, you know, about. So, you know, there are real people in America that think that would be the best thing. Yeah. But I don't see how the faith community can do anything but stand against that kind of authoritarian oppression. I just don't see how. Amen. How we can not just take up the fight.
Amen. Amen.
But I don't see I don't see my former workplace doing it.
Doing that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to just open it up here. We've got a few more minutes. Are there sort of questions or thoughts? Terry Knowles' hand shoots right up. Here we are.
Terry Knowles, who's sitting next to Marshall Rudder, who is also a board member at Bloy House. So you're surrounded by my allies.
Are you that Marshall Rudder? Wow. So Gary, your stories about your time at the National Cathedral beg to me the question, why did they choose you in the first place?
No, honestly, that's a good question. Honestly, they said they did the job description they did. They'd gone through a busted search, and when Kathy and I had gone to Paris for a week. We got back on the day before Palm Sunday. I went to my office. I was rector at Christ Church Cranbrook in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan at the time. I got back. There was this FedEx box on my desk, and this letter from the search committee saying, we think you're the right person to be the, dean. And I read the position description, and it was like describing me in every possible thing, including being a leader on issues. So, I mean, they had decided after several deanships that they really wanted a dean who would speak to national issues. So that's why they called me. And I think, I think then events happened that kind of got out a little bit faster than they were comfortable with. But, I mean, I'm now 74, almost 75, so I couldn't be there, but I could have stayed there another 5 years. But my feeling was, no, they really need someone who's more, that's more in their comfort zone. But they really were looking for someone like me at the time.
Yeah, Gary, I understand that you were the one that opened the doors of the cathedral to the Muslims worshiping on Fridays. Could you tell us how that happened and how it's going?
I wish Wilma Jacobson was here because he would know his name. The man who was the South African ambassador to the United States at the time was a Muslim imam and also the ambassador. And he had been a colleague of Tutu's in the ANC stuff. Do you have a name?
Okay.
And he approached me about the possibility of having a Muslim prayer service. And so we did that. It was on a Friday, and we put Persian rug. We took out the chairs in the north transept of the cathedral, very much like the north transept here at All Saints. North transept of the cathedral, and we put Persian rugs down, and we had a Muslim prayer service. And I have to tell you, the thing I know only a bit about Islam, but one of the things I know about the Quran is that it's supposed to have the most beautiful Arabic. That one of the reasons it's chanted is because, in the same way that Jews made a sanctuary out of time with the Sabbath, Muslims made a sanctuary out of the language of the Quran, and so the language itself is beautiful, and the sound of that chanting in the cathedral was just otherworldly. And again, there was a lot of blowback again from people like Franklin Graham about how we had desecrated a sacred Christian space, but they've continued to do that, and I think it's been wonderful. It's just if you haven't experienced Muslim prayer, it's really worthwhile to experience just for the I didn't understand it, but I certainly it really spoke to me at some level of my being that was somatic rather than intellectual.
Test. There we go. Yeah, thank you. Every time you come, there's not enough time. It really is. I really would love to sit down and have that cup of coffee with you. There's two things. One is a specific one, which is there's a story about the week leading up to the removal of the windows at the National Cathedral, and the fact that those windows were taken out in the evening, from what I understand. I don't know if I'm correct about that, when they were removed. And then secondly, something that you just talked about, which was the disagreement or your opposition when you had to go to the chapter. I think that's what you called it. And then you decided not to go on. And my question has to do with the church only being able to go so far, and complacency in times of change in terms of what this are, I think is one of the most dangerous things in the world, not to be able to stand up to it, because I just get reminded of the 1929s in Germany and where the church was with that. And I just see that possibly happening here. Am I wrong? Maybe so.
Just a brief thing about the windows. So the windows were two stained glass windows in memory of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. They were given by and paid for and designed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And they were put in 1953 when the Eisenhower administration had put pressure on the cathedral. They were trying, the South used to be solidly Democratic. The Eisenhower administration was trying to make inroads in the South. And so they were approached by the United Daughters of the Confederates, who also went to places like Vanderbilt, and they threw a lot of money around after World War II, basically trying to rebrand the Confederacy as the lost cause. And there were two things about the windows I didn't like. One of them was each one had a Confederate battle flag in it. And again, South Carolina had just taken down their Confederate battle flag, right, when Nikki Haley was governor, after the massacre at Mother Emanuel Church. And I thought, well, if South Carolina can take out their battle flags, why can't we? But then the inscriptions treated Lee and Jackson as if they were saints. And there was no window in the cathedral for African Americans except a window for George Washington Carver, the peanut guy. Now, Carver was a great guy, but he wasn't Martin Luther King, and he wasn't W.E.B. Du Bois, and he wasn't Frederick Douglass. So in other words, there was an asymmetry between Confederate representation and there was no mention of Jim Crow or anything like that. So that's why I called for them to come out. I really don't know what happened. They went through several stages. They did it by stages. They cut out, like with your glass cutter, they cut out the flags, right? But the rest of the windows were still there. And then they decided, no, they need to take them out. So then there was plywood for a long time. And the windows were on exhibit for a while at the National Museum of African American on the Mall in D.C. And I think they're back in the cathedrals. I never wanted them destroyed. I just wanted them contextualized and displayed somewhere else, not there. In terms of the other thing, I think, the church, and this is not just the Episcopal Church, the church is always, one of the great books I read in seminary, and I'm sure Mike read in seminary, was H. Richard Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, And we are always dealing with this issue of, are we worshiping the Christ of culture, the Christ against culture, or as Niebuhr used to say, the Christ who transforms culture? And I think for too many, especially white Christian churches, we're still worshiping the Christ of culture. And to the extent that we can have an ongoing conversion to Christ against or the transformer of culture, one of the questions Mike said he was going to ask me, which he didn't ask me, was the question of racism. And I said, I think when I left Washington, that I thought that racism was the number one issue that the Episcopal Church had to face. My feeling 8 years later is that we've done a good job institutionally dealing with racism at the national church level, at diocesan levels, at institutional levels. We've not done a good job at the pew level.
That's right.
And so our liturgy is still essentially a white liturgy.
Yeah.
Our hymnody is still essentially a white hymnody. And so the work now is really at the local level, like how do we acculturate the Episcopal Church to the diversity of the world in which we live? Amen. And so just that's a long way to answer your question, but we're always in danger of uncritically affirming the powers that be. And I think, again, the more I read the New Testament, especially Mark's Gospel, which we read this year, which is very stark. I mean, it's unlike, you can read it in 45 minutes, and it's just Jesus, goes out in today's Gospel, just goes out and boom, he's on the road proclaiming his message. And I think we have to decide whether we're with him or with the image that an imperial system has made of him. Mm-hmm. And, increasingly what is it, who was it said this? Maybe it was Alan Jones, the late dean of Grace Cathedral, who used to say, I'm drawn to the religion of Jesus, not the religion about Jesus. And I think that's right for me. So the gospel really, and it's interesting that in white Christian nationalism, they're now saying, well, they don't preach Jesus' teachings because they're too wimpy. Because they preach Old Testament stuff because it's all this combat language, right? but that a lot of these white evangelical pastors are now not even, like the Beatitudes are considered anathema in white Christian nationalist churches because they're seen as left-wing, you know.
Yeah. I'm reading a book right now that talks about, and actually sort of lived part of this, about John Fife and Southside Presbyterian Church and the sanctuary movement. And that was a local congregation. And many of you probably know the story of John Fife and Southside Presbyterian in Tucson, and that's where the sanctuary movement was born. And people were coming to America from El Salvador. Only 2% of them were getting asylum. And if they were sent back, they were being killed. And the congregation had to decide, are we going to do this? And risking their own survival as a congregation, not just the jailing of the pastor, but this was not a church that had deep pockets. They could have been run out of business really easily. And so, I think about, and in some ways this is what you faced at Washington National Cathedral. It is the pull of the gravity of concern for institutional survival, which is not a bad thing, against the pull of standing up with and for a gospel that puts in danger institutional survival. And I mean, as we sort of close, can you just sort of talk about how you see that tension continuing to evolve?
Well, one of the things I'm doing in my so-called retirement is I chair the diocesan committee, the program group on mission congregations, which oversees, we have 38 mission congregations, 28 of them would really require assistance from the diocese. And, every church, I just spent the last 18 months being the Sunday supply person at St. Albans Westwood, because there are almost 50 now vacant parishes in the Diocese of LA. Out of 138, there are 50 vacant churches without clergy leadership, either because they have no money to pay a priest, or priests are, after COVID and mutual recriminations about decline in attendance and giving, clergy are just saying, you know what, I've had enough, so long. And so I think we're in this moment of institutional anxiety, which I know is everywhere, and I'm sure it's here. That attendance and giving are down, but they're down everywhere. Seminaries are closing. I've closed too, and my friend Kelly Brown Douglas, when I got the job at Beloy House, said, "Well, Dr. Kevorkian, is it going to be 3 for 3?" Which is not our case, but we're in this moment, and I think the biggest mistake, but I see it happening everywhere across the system, is that we become confused about what our mission is. And many places are seeing it as their mission to keep the doors open rather than to do what we're called to do. Right. And so it seems to me we need to do, and I know I say this with the comfort of having a very generous church pension fund pension, Amen. Right? Which I'm very aware of. And I didn't face the kinds of challenges that my younger colleagues face. Even though I faced a lot of stressful things in my working life, the challenges today are exponentially greater, I think, in terms of the culture and all the other stresses. And so, the church world since COVID is just different in not only degree but kind since the church world before COVID, I think. And I think we've just got to keep on we've got to keep following Jesus and trying to do the right thing. And the institutional thing will shake out. It's not like we've been doing this since the day after Pentecost, right? My friend Ian Douglas, the former Bishop of Connecticut, talks about what does he call it? The Euro tribal culture of the Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. This expression of Anglicanism, which we all love so much, really only dates back to the 18th century, right? And All Saints has been here, since the 19th century, but, Christians were figuring this out for 1,800 years before we had the Episcopal Church parish system. So we'll figure it out. We'll have some new system. The gospel will be preached. Sacraments will be administered. It's not going to look like it did. And, I love the way it was.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of appreciation for the way it was. But I also think that God's faithfulness, our faithfulness to the gospel calls us to whatever new thing is coming toward us.
Amen. That's a good place to end part one. Part two will be your sermon. So let's get over into church, and thank you to Gary Hall.